Hey everyone, welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm your host, Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief of iPolitics. And once again, I'm joined by a fantastic crew of panelists for today's show. I'm starting with Cameron Ahmad, a former director of communications to PM Justin Trudeau. We have Kyla Ronellenfitsch, founder of Relay Strategies, and Nathoo, vice president of strategy and risk at Enterprise Canada. Thank you all for joining us. We have another busy show because, things just keep happening in Canadian politics. Really been a kind of fascinating, I want to say a few weeks. And today we, of course, have a new, I was going to say Auditor General, Governor General being named. But I actually wanted to start this discussion about an issue that I feel like has kind of ebbed and flowed in the public space for the past, 7-8 months, the pipeline debate. Prime Minister Carney has been making the rounds, doing some 1 year look back interviews. And he mentioned a few times that it's more a pipeline that would bring Alberta oil to the BC coast is more likely than not to happen. The big question I think everyone had when this first MOU was reached back in the fall was, is this a good political idea for the PM? So I don't want to necessarily resurrect that entire debate, but I'll start with you, Kyla. Once again, the PM seems to be being a bit more bullish about this idea than the past. Does it still make sense for him to be in support of this idea? Something that, under the Justin Trudeau, it seemed like the Liberals were not terribly comfortable with.
I don't know that this would necessarily come as any type of surprise for voters. I would describe this as something that he, not necessarily a pipeline specifically, but to get major projects built, to expand our trade relationships, to decrease our reliance on the United States. All of those things were things that he was elected to do. So whether or not this is a political winner or loser, I think probably pretty on brand political winner. It is, of course, also probably helpful that the direction that we assume the pipeline will go to out to the West Coast or even into the United States is probably an easier political path than something like resurrecting Energy's pipeline to go through Quebec. So I think overall probably a net neutral to net positive, especially when we start looking at polling numbers that we've seen, I would say particularly in Alberta, like we've seen this huge surge for the Liberals. That has happened in Alberta as well, which could put, different seats in play. I don't think that it's like necessarily political priority number one, but is important and something that we're seeing in the polls.
Yeah, and Cameron, you were in the trenches, and that's the first time around. What do you make of the PM, kind of signaling that he's bit more open than he did in the fall about this? What's the kind of level of political risk he's dealing with? Or to Kyla's point, is it very minimal?
I mean, I think there's always political risk on either side when you're the leader of the Liberal Party or a Liberal Prime Minister, because you have, to varying degrees, a big coalition of people who are very pro-environment, people who are pro-pipeline or pro-energy industry. And then you have a lot of people in between who believe, I think that's the biggest constituency. Kyla can, of course, correct me as the master of the data, but I think that's the biggest constituency is people who believe in some sort of compromise between the two, that you don't have to do one without the other. You don't have to just rely on energy, infrastructure, expansion, and fossil fuels without a climate plan. And the balance that the Prime Minister Trudeau tried to strike was obviously a very challenging one. But I think for Prime Minister Carney, it is less difficult for him to sell this because this is what he campaigned on, as Kyla was saying. He campaigned entirely on the idea that we can get big things built. Frankly, we have no choice right now because we cannot be as reliant on the United States as we always have been. But we can also have a climate plan. And I think those two things need to go together under his framing. So he's signaling that there's a greater openness to a pipeline right now, but I don't think that it in any way precludes a climate plan or an emissions reduction responsibility obligation on the industry.
And Fareed, what do you think about that? I mean, when we talked about this in the fall, one thing that came up was, the idea of a pipeline may be a bit more politically popular than it's been in years past. But once the rubber hits the road, maybe that conversation shifts. Is that still the case there? Like, even though there seems to be this groundswell support for the PM, seems to be pulling pretty high. I think both Cameron and Kyla hinted that there's always risk involved. But you think that conversation changes once we start landing on a potential route that we're going to see?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really interesting demonstration of the tensions on energy in today's economic and geopolitical situation and the environmental bona fides of the Liberal Party and of the Prime Minister's personal brand that the government's going to have to grapple with. If we look back at the TMX pipeline, it was originally purchased for $4.5 billion. Ultimate end cost $34 billion. complex costs are the reality for most of these major energy projects. To Kyla and Cameron's points, the federal government should weigh very, very carefully the cost of investment of federal funds. But that doesn't mean they can't invest other capital, namely political capital. I think the nature of the regulatory changes the PM has made mean that private sector capital is probably more than likely to support these projects, but that the government might have to chime in on regulatory approvals, helping to work with Indigenous peoples on the route, environmental considerations. Those are investments of the Prime Minister and the government's brand and credibility. Ultimately, my perspective is like there's still a huge differential between WTI and Western Canadian. So there's probably margin to be made, and that depends on the route, capital cost, consumption rates. But I think there's still a business case for a pipeline, and that the private sector probably comes forward with a really viable proposal.
And Fareed makes a good point. Cameron, I'm curious what you think. Do you think, if is the PM trying to signal that, he might be a bit more willing to put public dollars towards this project? And if he does that have any impact with how it's perceived politically?
It would, yes. But I think to what Fareed was just saying, I wouldn't go that far yet. I don't think that's what he's necessarily saying. He might be saying down the road, depending on what kind of business cases come forward, we're open because we have said we need major projects to get built. That includes projects that can export our oil to different markets than the United States, especially in Asia. But I would begin by looking at what are the other ways, frankly, the more direct and useful ways for the government to support projects like this, all while maintaining a climate plan, or at least climate obligations, emissions reductions obligations on the industry, regulatory approval, mediating between Indigenous groups, provincial and municipal governments, and creating a pathway for the project to get built without necessarily signaling a check at this stage.
And you brought up the climate policies. So I'll stick with you because it comes, this push or this, new messaging from the PM comes as we see some oil companies kind of rev up their advocacy to see more climate policies kind of pulled back. And we had an op-ed from a former Liberal MP who I think is now with Suncor saying this is not the right time for pathways. So considering, your point earlier, this pipeline can come in concert with a whole suite of climate policies. Now we're seeing the energy industry kind of say, maybe the latter point we're not a big fans of. What do you make of that? Do you think if that happens, if we see this full kind of repeal, do you think, all bets are out the door or out the window or what?
It's really hard to say right now to predict what's going to happen in the future because of the state of the world that we're living in. I think that's probably always going to be the starting point for people who represent the industry. And it's the Prime Minister's job and frankly, very difficult challenge to figure out how there can be maintain emissions reductions rules or frameworks on expansion of the sector. So I'm not surprised to see that that's what they're saying and perhaps taking advantage of the moment we're in where there's a greater appetite for fossil fuel expansion in the country. But we have to think not only about this election cycle, but we also have to think long term about where the rest of the world is going and how other governments around the world are also thinking about sort of 10, 20, 50-year pathways for their industry, their development and their competitiveness. So Canada has to find the right balance there. And I think I would be surprised to see the Prime Minister abandon all of the Trudeau era climate policies. There might have to be some changes to them, but that's definitely a tough challenge for him to strike right now.
And for you, what's your read? Do you think the PM is trying to is he trying to send any signals on this, or and if he does, what are the consequences of even more further retraction of those Trudeau era climate policies?
We have an initial indication of what his climate policy looks like, right? The nature strategy released last month gives us a first indication, but I don't think we have a fulsome impression of what Mark Carney as the Prime Minister wants his climate and environmental policy to look like. At this point, a significant proportion of seats for the PM are in Quebec and in the lower mainland of Vancouver. Environmental action, Kyla will correct me, it's still in the top 5 political issues for voters, but it's not this high as it previously was in the context of the current economy. It's still a huge priority for those voters. That's probably fine for now, given where the PM is sitting vis-a-vis approval ratings, but he'll probably need a more defined climate policy in advance of the next election. And I think that fits well with his brand. I think if he's able to bring a climate policy that meets investment where it is and meets the geopolitical situation where it is, it'll be a pretty compelling narrative for him to share with the country.
Yeah. my first thought was, is it in the top 5 of a list of 6? Because no. But it's interesting. I think that these are very I guess they can be related issues, but I sort of think of them, or the way that voters think about them, in the same way when it comes to environmental policy and when it comes to fiscal prudence. I feel like Canadians do not want either of these things to be seen as not on our leaders' minds. Like, they are not necessarily the priority number one, but you cannot be seen to neglect them. And I think for Carney currently, I think that people assume he has this big like halo effect with all of his professional background. There's sort of he benefits from blanket perceived competence. People think that, this is the smartest guy in the room. He's thinking of this and thinking of that and blah, blah, blah. So he has to be seen, continue to be seen as, and he has a lot of leeway, frankly, to be seen as someone who is striking this correct balance. But the second that it feels like actually the environment has been entirely neglected, that there has been a bait and switch of some type, like people have perceived that he would be reasonable when it comes to the environment, I think that is a tremendous risk. And so when we talk about, will there be more rolling back of Trudeau era climate policies? Perhaps. I think he has a lot of space to communicate with Canadians the why. Like he has this moment to speak in full sentences and to really talk to the trade-offs, and that moment doesn't necessarily last for forever. So when I think of, any pushback from, let's say, oil executives or from resource development in general, I feel like for them, I would be very cautious of getting over in front of your skis or whatever the expression is, because right now, the Prime Minister really holds the ability to set the conversation and the narrative and how these issues are perceived. And I probably, given how much he's been able to sort of move the public on these issues to bring them with him, I would be, pretty cautious in acting like he has not been doing enough when it comes to resource development and these large projects.
And I'm curious about what Therese and Cameron think, because, I think, Kyla, that's interesting that it seems like the Canadian public at large are giving the PM. But I'll start with you, Therese. In the Liberal caucus, there's those divisions are quite obvious in some places in terms of the people who have, stated their opposition to pipelines or have been a bit more, I don't know, a bit less comfortable with fossil fuel extraction than others. If this, issue does come to a fore and we do see a new pipeline proposed that the government, gives a green light to, what do we make of those divisions? Does it really matter at this time? This guy is so popular. This caucus just going to kind of, bend over and say, sure, we don't love it, but we'll criticize you publicly on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think any of those MPs that you're describing in caucus have ever bent over on any of these issues. I think they're very clear in expressing themselves. And I think they do so pretty articulately, right? Like, they represent a constituency and they come with significant experience in this regard. I also think it's interesting how some of these things are playing out in real time. So, for example, the recent spring economic update announced that enhanced oil recovery would qualify under additional investment tax credits. That's an example of a different type of energy policy that has environmental aspects. And I think seeing how caucus and the public and energy executives react to this in real time and how that drives both public opinion and investment decisions, two things any government, but particularly this government, is very sensitive to, is going to be interesting. And also will pose challenges along the way as different MPs and different aspects of the party make their voices known.
Yeah, I mean, I think Elizabeth May said she felt like she got run over by a truck or something. Some very colorful language. I don't know how many people in the Liberal caucus second that. What's your take, Cameron?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a tremendous amount of I mean, we've seen some of it. Like, we saw Stephen Guilbeault's reaction, and we've seen other MPs express frustration or feel like level of disappointment. But again, that's always a challenge when you're managing a big caucus of people with very diverse views from across the country, very different priorities, depending on which part of the country they represent. So it's never going to be an easy tapestry for the Prime Minister to keep together. But now is a good time for these views to be aired. And I do think that as much as the environment is not as big of a priority today, and doesn't seem to be in Canadians' minds for the foreseeable future, that can always change. And there is a danger in looking at today's polling and assuming that that's going to be the same way people think in a year or 5 years from now. And so what the Prime Minister is doing, and as Kyla said so well, in full sentences, explaining his thinking, really bringing Canadians in to the way that he is decision-making in real time, and not sort of pretending like he understands better and doesn't really need to justify himself. I think now is a really good time for him to keep explaining why he has to make some compromises, why the world has changed, why some of the policies that same voters who elected him championed just a few years ago, why some of those policies have to be dropped or replaced with something else. And so as long as he keeps doing that, as long as the opposition parties remain sort of irrelevant from a leadership standpoint, I think he's in a really good position to keep signaling how and why he's making these difficult decisions.
Yeah, I'm curious, on that same vein of, the PM kind of seemingly having a good read of the room and that voter support behind him. On Canada-U.S. trade, we've seen this issue really kind of ramp up in intensity the past few weeks, with Pierre Poilievre basically saying, tell us your plan for this. And the PM, and obviously I'm paraphrasing, basically saying, we're not going to negotiate publicly. That's not a good idea. And some liberals have been, not so quietly mocking Pierre for making that suggestion. Kyla, I'll start with you. Is that still a successful move of the PM, considering, to your point, it seems like Canadians trust this guy's judgment, him basically saying, don't worry, bro, I got this. Is that still like a message that's going to resonate?
I mean, I think it's always important to remember how Canadians perceive Donald Trump, which is not just, we kind of know generally he's very unpopular in this country, that his unfavorables are extremely high. But it's a lot more than that. It's that people think that he is kind of an irrational actor. And when we ask Canadians about, what is the best way to deal with him, it's kind of like your guess is as good as mine. Like, it is a little bit, it's because he's seen as kind of irrational. They're willing to go along with the Prime Minister and, he's in the room. Like, there's a lot of that kind of feeling. So if he says, we're not going to negotiate out in the open, there's probably, a lot of, yeah, that makes sense. And we see how much this can become kind of a clown show. And as much as we can take it out of the headlines, all of that is probably a good thing. I do find that, to his, I don't know about credit, but like, to put myself in the shoes of Pierre Poilievre, he's in an extremely difficult position. And a lot of that is the fundamentals of public opinion and what people think of him versus Carney. Like, if we look at issue advantage on any of the items that are, I would say, relevant to this moment, things like representing Canada on the world stage or dealing with the current economic crisis caused by Trump's tariffs, Carney outperforms Poilievre by 20 plus points on those different measures. So any critiques that he has of the way that the Prime Minister is negotiating, he should do this instead of that. Okay, who is compelled by that? I don't know. Like, it is probably it is actually his least advantageous area to try and strike a contrast. So to a certain extent, I don't really know why he's trying to. Like, it is not really I don't think a message that has any real degree of punch.
Kyla, I want to give myself a shameless plug, but the other week when I asked the PM the question about Pierre Poilievre's criticism on this file, and he gave me the what's he ever negotiated, did any political leader aside from him get away with it? Like it seems like if Pierre Poilievre was doing that, it seems like it would have attracted a lot of controversy. Is it just that people perceive Pierre Poilievre as just running off at his mouth, or they just trust Mark Carney and just like Mark Carney more than him?
I mean, all of the above. I don't know. Part of it is the moment. If Mark Carney was not, I don't know, 20 points more popular in terms of favorability and up, 10, 12 points in the polls, would it be perceived as the same way if there was a 1 point gap and he was kind of just dismissing Poilievre? Maybe it would be perceived differently. But I think it goes back to what we saw play out in the last campaign, which, of course, we talked a lot about how much the campaign was about Trump versus cost of living, but a lot of it was kind of an old school, like lining up the CVs kind of test of this person is immensely qualified in this moment, and this person has done less in their professional lives outside of politics. And it's sort of that simple. And so we can kind of get away with it because it strikes as true. Like, I did a lot of focus groups during the campaign, and yeah, the shocker, you heard it here first on this podcast, but politicians, not necessarily the most popular as like a category. So the idea that, Pierre Poilievre has only ever been a politician, yeah, that's pretty damaging as a point of contrast to Mark Carney. So Mark Carney being able to say, you know what, he's never done anything within this realm. It's sort of how many Canadians see it as well.
I want to get Cameron and Freeze in here, since you guys are both experts when it comes to those narratives. Do you think that's just the question here when it comes to Canada-U.S. trade? A lot of Pierre's criticism will fall flat because not only is Mark Carney popular, but he won the election basically saying, I'm not going to just bull over and roll over and do whatever the Americans say. I have a plan. I have a vision. Canadians trust me on this at this point, barring any further deterioration in that relationship.
Yeah, I think so. As Kyla said, Pierre Poilievre absolutely is in a tough spot from a messaging perspective and strategically, because what does he have to offer? What does a leader of any opposition party have to offer in this very tense debate when everybody's sort of rallying around the flag and wants the Prime Minister to succeed. I do think, though, that this constant sniping and criticism that we've seen from the Conservatives is not really going to do anything for them unless negotiations get really bad and the dynamic between the administration and the Prime Minister and his negotiating team get really bad. But for now, I think the best thing that he did was when he traveled to the US and tried to appear to be on the same team and as a constructive player. So if I were advising them, that's what I would say. Like, try and show up in a way that many premiers are, business leaders are, union leaders are, as part of the same Team Canada approach. But if you're constantly sniping from the sidelines because of how Canadians feel about the administration and they understand Trump's irrational behavior and they see how every other country in the world is dealing with the exact same thing we are, this approach doesn't really achieve anything. And it's the same, very similar dynamic to when, Prime Minister Trudeau and his team were dealing with the first Trump administration. Of course, we could not lay out all our cards out on the table. That's just not how any negotiation works. And I don't think it's how reasonable Canadians would expect their government to operate. They know how tough it is for them, and they know how important it is for them to be strategic and thoughtful, how every move matters and how every headline can then impact the actual discussions. So I think they have a lot of capital, and they're being as thoughtful and strategic as they can be so that they can get the best deal for the country and not just quick wins.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. It's the challenge of the moment for Mr. Poilievre, but it's also been more than a year, and I don't think they've been able to string together like a comprehensive perspective and share that on a repeated basis. And you compound that with the fact that they're also dealing with Mr. Giovanni, not only Marco, to your point, sniping from the sidelines, but sniping from within the House. So, Mr. Poilievre's put out this idea, so let's humor it, right? So he wants the federal government to detail leverage, demands, tariffs targeted removal and a timeline for a deal. I cannot possibly imagine a scenario in which sharing this publicly would do anything other than disadvantage Canada in the negotiations, plus work to anger the president. Anytime that happened in any of the other negotiations that Trump has had with any other country in the world, it has not gone well. So that's thing one. So then he's labeled a specific sector, energy, and said we should use that as leverage. Look, on any specific sector, the Prime Minister has a really challenging balancing act in representing the country as a whole without hurting one province or another's major industries more. I cannot possibly imagine a scenario in which Premier Smith would take kindly to Alberta oil and gas being used as leverage in a public negotiation. It just would not happen. So the facts are the facts, right? The U.S. needs Canadian oil and gas, critical minerals, and more. They know it. We know it. Saying so in a grand statement does nothing to help the two countries land a deal. Also, if we try to use energy as leverage and they call our bluff, we do not currently have a way of selling our energy elsewhere outside of the TMX pipeline, which is nearly at max capacity. So if you kind of go point by point and you think through what he's offering substantively on ideas, I sort of struggle to see what his endpoint is, and I struggle to see what his coherent approach is on offering that kind of commentary from the side.
No, that's a great point, Farees. I'm just curious, Kyla, too, because the way I read some of the messaging from the Conservative camp in the past few weeks was, they really, hopped onto the PM's messaging around a rupture with the US, saying, well, he wants us to basically sever all ties with the Americans. Now, obviously, I'm grossly exaggerating, but basically the idea is he doesn't want to do business with Americans anymore. He wants to go do business, namely with China. Mm-hmm. Whereas we, we're the happy friends. We want to be best buds with the Americans again. Based on your polling, based on the fact that people do not trust the Trump administration in this country, do not terribly like the Trump administration in this country, is that not an inherently risky proposal for the Conservatives to put forward?
Yes, I don't understand what they're doing. Because it is so much deeper than just Trump. Like, if you ask Canadians, do you think that the relationship will rebound to where it was? Let's say if we get rid of Donald Trump. More likely than not, no. Like, this is seen as a long-term division. Yeah, so it is a tremendous risk. Also, if we look at, I've now looked at this on a variety of different measures. Like, the American reputation has declined so significantly in this country, where they are viewed as unfavorable as a partner, as China. Like, it is. A lot of this is, I would say, maybe potentially a little bit skewed in terms of like what people are seeing, but or how they perceive it. But that is the height, or that is the degree of the anger that Canadians have, where I don't think that, this China as the boogeyman is not like the most prominent boogeyman in people's minds right now. It is the US. And that is a significant change. And I don't really know why this is a territory that they want to fight on, especially after, the idea that we've experienced this rupture came at what I would describe as the most significant political event of the year, which was the Davos speech, which sounds like a crazy thing to say. Like in any other political moment, you would say, oh, a speech from Davos being the most important political event. Like, no. But it was, and it was the framing around that. And that is a big part of the reason why the Liberals have experienced a surge in the polls this year and why it is held. It is just a clear definition of how Canadians are feeling about the US. And so to go back 3 months later, 4 months later, and say, actually, this really popular speech that he gave, this central message in that speech, that was wrong, and we would like to debate it now. It's a very strange strategic choice.
I think in any other year, we would say Davos speech went viral. We'd say what went wrong, right? Like we'd be asking ourselves what happened.
You guys feel like you must be getting whiplash, though. A couple of years ago, Pierre was saying, none of my ministers are going to go to Davos. It's where all the elites, conform with each other. Now, apparently the biggest political moment of the year is a really, thoughtful speech from the PM there. But I'm just curious, I guess, to Kyla's point, attacking from that angle might not work. Conversely, I'm curious if there's any space for, a progressive party like the NDP to attack the PM for not being, I don't know, a bit more aggressive with the Americans. We saw under Don Davies, there were some attacks about too many concessions the Canadians were making, such as the digital services tax in particular. Do you think there's any kind of oxygen there to attack the PM from that angle? Or do you think, he's at this point, he's got that base covered considering negotiations are kind of at a standstill?
Look, I think a Liberal Party, any governing Liberal Party needs to be constantly thinking about its progressive flank as well. That's the wing of the party that sort of has driven us forward, has encouraged us to think more creatively about policy making and where the party is going in the direction of the country. But to answer your specific question, Marco, I struggle to see a way back for the NDP right now. I think they're very resource constrained. They have a leader without a seat in the House, and they're struggling for relevance in an environment where their party's kind of been whittled down to repeat elected officials in major urban centers. So I think the challenge for them is to find a road back that re-engages rural NDP voters that have by and large picked conservative or liberal parties to represent themselves.
What about you, Cameron? Because one thing I heard too with in the aftermath of the PM's initial comments about the Iran war caucus, some members of the progressive flank of the Liberal caucus were expressing concerns about alignment. Do you think that's do you think there is any oxygen right there? Or to Free's point, the NDP right now is so weak in it, it's not really.
Look, no matter how popular a leader or prime minister or party are, there's always oxygen somewhere. The question is, for the opposition, is to find where that is, like where specifically they can generate some sort of political advantage. But right now, I think they're all grasping, and I see it similarly with the Conservatives and with the NDP. They don't know what their pathway is to regaining relevance, credibility, looking like leaders in waiting. So they're trying different things. And frankly, the majority that Carney was able to assemble is probably the best thing for both of them. It's the best thing that happened this year because it gives them time to rebuild financially, to come up with a credible message, to build a narrative, to showcase their leaders. I think the Conservatives are failing over and over because they just keep, trying these strategies that I don't know who's telling them could work. The NDP, they're really starting from such a low position that the bar is really low. And so I think the best thing they can try to do is to really show like they're standing up for workers, for labor, for low wage earners, for people who don't really have there may be some sort of narrative that could be built over time that they don't have a voice within the Liberal Party anymore because it's shifted. But right now I think it's kind of too early to tell. And I don't think that what either of them are doing are going to bear much fruit.
And I'm curious, Kyla, what your numbers are showing, because I feel like when Avi, was first elected leader, was doing the rounds on the CBC radio, and I heard all that criticism. But one thing that stood out was the number showing that most Canadians don't have an impression on Avi Lewis. I don't think his approval ratings or whatever are terribly high, but Is that still what it's showing? Like most people haven't made up their mind on what to think
Yeah, and
about
it'll take
Avi
time.
yet?
Like our understanding of politics moves quite rapidly because we spend a lot of time. This is what we do, so we spend a lot of time thinking of it. For Canadians, it takes a long time to build a brand. It takes a long time to develop a significant impression, especially as Cameron pointed out, he does not have a seat. It's not like they have endless resources to do some massive, introductory ad campaign or something like that. Like a lot of it is pretty organic at this point. But we've seen, some moments kind of break through. In particular, when we look at Google Trends data and the moments that popped the most this year, him being elected as leader was, I think, the third most significant moment in Google Trends data. Whether or not they received a really lasting impression from him from that moment, it seems not really in the polls. But there's a lot there. It's big, opportunity and threat. People don't really know him well. I will say that a lot of the territory that they're trying to occupy, it's very fruitful territory. Like if you look at the data under the surface, there is a very strong vein of anti-corporate sentiment in this country. The issues related to cost of living are very resonant. There are many things that he is speaking to that can find a home. Whether or not that Canadians are as compelled by those issues as the issue set that the Liberals currently own around Trump, around our position in the world, the way that the government is proposing to build our economy, like does the Avi Lewis vision, is that a more compelling vision than the Carney vision? Today, probably not, but in 3 years, I don't know. Like everything is fluid, as we very well know. If we look back to a little over a year ago, if we look 15 months back, it looked extremely different, and you would have said it was impossible to achieve that rate of change. You just never know. Yeah, there's, I would say, is there a risk from the left flank? Yes, always, forever. Is there a risk from a right flank? Yes, always. Yeah, voters are not they're not partisans, and they can be convinced by many different points of view. Sometimes those points of view are counter to one another. It just kind of depends what is the story of the day and who is the storyteller and what is landing.
Yeah, I do think there is fertile ground for the NDP, not, as Kyla said, necessarily from a left flank, like from an ideological perspective, but if things stay tough for Canadians as they are right now, as the economy falters, as people might lose their jobs, as wages don't go up and salaries don't increase and housing remains a huge challenge, of course, there's always a huge risk for the government for its voice to be replaced essentially by someone with a louder and more compelling voice. So no matter how popular you always are, you have to be very mindful of the likelihood for another person, another party, another storyteller to come in and take that place. And right now, I think is very fertile territory for someone else to swoop in. And the NDP probably have an easier job of it just because they are the new leader is not known. Nobody really in Canada knows who he is. So I think he can define himself, whereas Pierre Poilievre has tried for a long time to define himself, has failed, and continues
He actually
to
has
flail
defined
around.
himself, but that's the challenge, is once you are defined, to pivot is extremely difficult. You're on mute, Mark.
I was going to joke that everyone here was so smart that obviously in December 2024, we all could have anticipated that a 25-point polling advantage could have gone up in thin air. What I was thinking at that time, I'm not going to repeat because it's going to make me look like a dumbass now. But for our final topic, I want to talk about the other big news from this week. The Alberta Separatist movement has submitted their petition, which would cross the threshold to trigger a referendum question. I'll start with you, Fariz. Is this a big worrying sign, or considering some polling that we've seen, and Kyla, I'll ask you about this later, showing that there's relatively not terribly strong support in Alberta for it? Maybe this has been overblown. Like, what's your read of that situation?
Yeah, but bottom line up front, I do not think a referendum does Canada or Alberta, and especially our economies, any good. Huge blow to investor confidence at a moment where trust is probably one of our greatest exports as we kind of re-engage in the world in this moment. I did want to spend a bit of time, Marco, talking about the data breach. That's the data of nearly 3 million Albertans posted publicly. That's a horrific breach, right? Huge democratic, but also public safety, fraud, personal information protection implications. Given RCMP investigations, Elections Alberta had to go to court to get the data taken down off a third-party website. There's a legal challenge from 3 First Nations that the Court of the King's Bench still has to rule on before Elections Alberta can even begin to verify the results. So I think it is a very troubling development. Kyla's going to dive more into the polling, but my sense is there's a healthy margin, but I don't think any of us want to tempt the Brexit fates and speculate on the outcome. It's a really tense moment that has significant economic, political, and democratic consequences for the country.
I mean, yeah, Kyla, what's your read on this? Is this, to Freeze's point, regardless of what the polling shows, should we still be concerned? Or right now, is it seeming like it's a bit of an issue that doesn't really have a lot of traction?
Yeah, well, Polera actually put out some data on this. I think that they had the most recent poll, because obviously these things can move quite quickly, or especially on this issue. So they've been tracking for 5 years, and the appetite for separatism is the highest it's ever been. It's still at 25%. 69% of people say no. But again, movement is movement, and that's a little bit worrying. I think when I look at Alberta, though, there's that question. But then if we look at, if I was to today include a question that was like, do you think that Alberta is being screwed over by the federal government? I will promise you the perception is much more broad than 25%. So I think the big risk is that people see this as some type of protest vote, and not necessarily a vote for separatism itself, but a vote for negotiation. That's kind of a thing that you hear on the ground in Alberta, is that perception that, maybe in that way it's kind of worth it, and we can be put in a stronger negotiation framework. All of this comes with, obviously, as Teresa said, tremendous risk to the country, both in terms of unity, but also in terms of kind of economic risk. Also, it's just kind of even if an unsuccessful referendum happens, it's kind of a big waste of time. These things are not free. They take up a lot of attention from the government itself, who could be doing other things. It takes up resources, all of these kinds of things that is, I think, often kind of overlooked in the conversation, as if, just asking a question is free. It's not. Yeah. So if I look at a 25-69 proposition, I'm not comforted by that at all. I think that there's a lot under the surface that indicates risk.
And Cameron, I'm curious what you think, because it seems like, to Kyla's point, that's the message that those sort of, in Quebec, we heard a lot too. It's not necessarily a vote for independence, it's a vote for greater political autonomy. Is there any, reason to believe that messaging might gain more traction, considering, to Kyla's point, there does seem to be a lot of underlining sentiment there that Ottawa's screwing us over?
Yes. I mean, I won't repeat everything that's been said, but I do think that there's huge amount of risk as this goes forward for the country's unity, for its economy, for investor confidence, as Free said. And it's almost as if this couldn't come at a worse time for us collectively as Canadians, and for the government. For the Prime Minister, I do think that the best way to handle it is, and there's no simple way, is not to treat the movement or the people who behind it with contempt or with panic. He certainly never really demonstrates any panic, but to try and keep working hard at building this bargain and compromise between necessary stewardship of the environment, but greater investment and exports of our natural resources. And in a future, looking at it through the lens of how we can build Canada to be stronger and more competitive on the global stage. And so these are lots of things that he has to balance, but I think that's the only way that he can move forward, is to keep working hard with the Premier, with industry, but do so from a position of leadership. And
so,
and hopefully
Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I do think that we'll see where this goes once the conversations with the province and industry go forward. But it can't just be a yes or a no, because there's the rest of the country to think about as well. But the continued development of the energy industry in Canada, which the oil sands play a huge part of, is really critical for him as he tries to strike this compromise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wanted to move to our last segment, which is when we actually look ahead or look backward and share, something that we're looking forward to in the week ahead, or something that we think maybe was important that got kind of lost in the shuffle in the week that passed. I'll start with you,
Looking
Kyla.
forward to, you teased it at the very beginning. We have a new Governor General, so I'm interested in kind of doing. It's been a busy day, so I haven't had the time to really dive into everything. So I'm looking forward to that, and what that, these things are largely symbolic roles, and so I'm really, I don't know, excited, I guess, a little bit to see what is that symbolism, and what is this kind of indicating as maybe a change of direction or a change of, I don't know, storytelling, I guess, that we were telling about ourselves. What was the second part of the question?
Or choose to something
Sure.
you're looking forward to in the back. But how about you, Freeze?
So one of the things that, I get really nerdy about and love is the legislative and parliamentary affairs of it all. And so I was really interested to see that, one, the spring economic update only had 11 new legislative measures, and two, that the Statement Implementation Act that they've tabled is only 42 pages. That's a real departure from certainly any of the budget implementing legislation of the several years past, which were like often several hundred pages. And it's a reflection of the fact that the government now has a majority, and they can move legislation through at a higher clip. But it also shows that they need more legislation to program the House with. So there's also a financial crimes agency bill that's separately traveling to this spring economic update. How different committees, how the House, how stakeholders kind of dig into those bills and how they move and how quickly they move through the legislative process, I think will be really interesting to watch. And it'll be an interesting demonstration of the government flexing its majority muscles.
That's a great point. I didn't even think about it. The smaller omnibus bill might be necessary to help you have some more legislation to move through, considering you don't need to have these standoffs anymore with the minority parliament. But that's a great point. How about you, Cameron?
I think looking forward, it's the appointment of a new Governor General, who is by all measures probably one of the best people that the Prime Minister could have appointed, who has just an incredible track record. And I think a lot of Canadians will remember having made Canada proud, like making the country proud on the world stage. And I think it fits very nicely with how the Prime Minister has been trying to recast Canada's image on the world stage, and how he sees this institution playing an important part of our democracy. And then looking back, it's the Prime Minister's trip to Armenia with European leaders. I think what he's being able to demonstrate is how deftly he can handle international relations and our diplomatic connections to other countries, saying things that sound sometimes a bit surprising to us, like how a new world order and new international order based on rules and sort of innovation is going to come from Europe, which I think a lot of people in North America would be surprised to hear. But a lot of European leaders love to hear something like that coming from a North American leader. So to see how that plays both with these relationships that he's building up in Europe, and as we keep looking at negotiations with Kuzma here in North America, I think that's going to be interesting too.
Yeah, that's terrific. I guess for me, you kind of hit the nail on the head with this, Cameron. Accusation negotiation, how that dynamic kind of shifts. I'll be honest, it seems like there's a very coordinated effort from our friends down south to kind of put as much pressure on the Carney government to get back to the negotiating table. And I think they're very frustrated that the PM seems unbothered, unfazed. And he was pretty upset with some of the line of questionings that he got the other week around this topic. He seemed, saying, hey, I got a strategy. I got a plan, guys. We're not going to negotiate publicly with these guys. I'm not worried. I'm not phased. I don't know why you guys are. And I'm very curious to see how that strategy works, whether the heat just keeps getting hotter and hotter in advance of the midterms. And if this is the long-term goal, or short-term goal, I should say, to wait out, see how the dust settles in November. Very, very curious to see if that strategy will be effective, or if we're going to see the worst version of Donald Trump if his party suffers major losses, where he's on a total tantrum and makes life even more difficult. So very curious to see how that strategy kind of plays out. But everyone, thank you all for joining me. I thought we had a terrific conversation. Cameron, Freeze, Kyla, please come back very, very often. And for all our viewers/listeners watching this, thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week.